vintage fragrances versus modern fragrances. Is there really a big difference between them? Yes and no. There are definitely some particular differences that I am going to pick out, but there are also quite a lot of similarities. So it depends on the fragrance, depends on the time period, that sort of thing. The first thing that I will say that I have noticed, at least from the types of fragrances that I've been smelling, is the style. What was popular at the time compared to now. Obviously things are always going to change with the times, but you could really tell with fragrances. From what I have deduced, from what I have noticed with the fragrances that I've tried, and I've tried fragrances from pretty much every decade, I would say that most, vintage fragrances from the 20s, 30s to 40s, even, going on from there, for women, at least, what was popular was quite heavy, musky fragrances. Beginning in the 1920s, women, were becoming a little bit more liberated, and they were making a break from what was considered appropriate at the time, which was light floral fragrances for women, to fragrances that were quite a bit heavier, like Shalimar or Chanel No. 5, and things like that. Even Taboo from Dana, which came out in the 30s. These very, very heavy, musky fragrances that, for women, that are really not that popular today. Today's kind of fragrance market is more focused on, I would say, sweet fragrances, even sugary sweet. You have La Vie Belle, you have Baccarat Rouge 540, these more sugary, sweet, dessert-esque types of fragrances, and that sort of thing, along with fruity fragrances. Quite a lot of fruit-centered fragrances I've come across, but it is a big difference because I would say, some of the old-time vintage women's fragrances, again, like Taboo or Shalimar, those could probably be marketed as men's fragrances today, even though, of course, they were originally marketed towards women back in the day. And that kind of heavy, musky trend for women continued for a while. You have Youth Dew from Estee Lauder that came out in 1953. You have some of, you have 1000 from Jean Patou, which was a very woodsy, very dry, relatively heavy women's fragrance that came out in the early 70s, I believe. Then, of course, the 80s was kind of, again, all musky, all animalistic, Obsession from Calvin Klein, which I think came out in 85. I don't remember exactly, but another example of an extremely heavy women's fragrance that, again, could be marketed as a male fragrance today, with today's expectations. I would say probably only in the last maybe 20 or 30 years was there a big change from that, maybe becoming a little bit softer, and especially in the last 10 years, maybe 15 years, with those really sweet, sugary fragrances. But that's just one example of a difference between vintage and modern fragrances, is that style, and how it kind of fits into the decade. The other thing that I've noticed with vintage fragrances is that they seem to be stronger. It could just be, again, because of those really heavy notes, but I find that they just last a lot longer than at least a lot of popular mainstream fragrances today. Even fragrances that are meant to be a little bit lighter, like you have Chanel No. 5, you have Les du Temps from Nina Ricci, more floral. They still last a really, really long time. They are grounded by some muskier notes, but they're still more floral, they're still lighter, but they just last a really long time. They have a really prominent projection, scent trail, all of that. And I have heard, like, some older fragrances are reformulated to a newer type of the fragrance, and everyone always swears that the original pre-reformulation versions are always better. The originals are always better, because usually when they're reformulated, they seem to be a little bit weaker, a little bit different, you know, doesn't have that same smell to it. So basically the power that they had, they seem to have more prominent power and longevity, especially back then. And I will say, it's not the fragrance itself, but I will say the bottle design. If you look, and I would say probably from 1960s earlier, even 50s to earlier, they really went all out with their bottle designs. These days, if you look at an average perfume bottle, it's usually a square. It is a glass square. Maybe the top has a little something, but a little design. Look at the original bottle of Shalimar. It was Baccarat crystal, beautiful. It was designed to be in the shape of an urn, sort of thing. That's just one example. Even one of the early bottles of Emeraude by Coty was designed to look like an emerald, because Emeraude means emerald in French. Really, you know, beautiful cut glass sort of thing. The modern bottle of Emeraude is supremely ugly, with just a kind of beige plastic cap. But those vintage bottles were really, really unique, really spectacular compared to today's bottles, which again is not relating to the fragrance itself, but just the presentation of the fragrance, which I think is still important. But that's just how it is. The company's got to cut corners, I suppose, at some point. But these are just a few examples of the differences between vintage fragrances and modern fragrances. I mean, the common denominator is that they both aim to smell pretty good, and I think most of them do. But that's pretty much what I have to say for that difference between vintage and modern. I personally prefer vintage fragrances. If you've watched many of my videos, you know that I tend to gravitate towards more vintage style fragrances. And again, that's mainly because, as I mentioned before, they're more musky, more woodsy, that sort of thing, and I just gravitate more towards those types of fragrances compared to sugary, sweet, or fruity. So that's just a personal preference of mine. You guys can let me know if you prefer vintage or modern fragrances better, or if you have a particular favorite, but that is the end of my video here. So if you enjoyed it, of course you can leave a like, maybe subscribe, and I make videos throughout the week, so stick around for those.